thanks everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Jen Frazier, CEO of Firefly Partners. We'll get into intros in a second. I just want to say thanks everyone for showing up and talking about digital accessibility today. I've got some things I'm supposed to read. The session's being recorded and streamed. Please stay masked while indoors and not actively eating and drinking. Seats in the back of the room have some extra room for those who would like some additional space. And then please, I know this will be tough for all of us here, but keep the aisles and any marked accessibility spaces open and clear for folks that need them. And with that, we're going to dive in. All right, so today I've got a lovely panel who will introduce themselves in a moment, and we're going to do some introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about digital accessibility just on a broad level and go through some concepts and high-level ideas about different ideas around digital accessibility for folks. We're going to get into a longer Q&A session and open discussion with our panelists who each have some personal and professional experiences in the digital accessibility space. But I really do want to provide quite a bit of time for you folks who've come today to ask questions and interact with our experts on the stage to get as detailed as we want and go as far as you want in terms of, like, we've got, technical expertise and personal expertise again. So any questions about digital accessibility, we want to make sure we hear from you. And during the Q&A, if you can ask your question, I'll repeat it so that everyone can hear it and so that the folks doing the live stream can hear it. And then if you want to address anybody on the panel specifically, you can call them out, or you can sort of keep it, say anybody can answer a question you have when we get there. Okay, great. Like I said, I'm Jen Frazier. I'm the founder of Firefly Partners. We are a digital agency, and we work with all of you lovely, progressive, social justice nonprofits out there kicking butt in the world, and we try to help you do things in your digital spaces effectively and accessibly and inclusively. So that's what we have been doing. Started Firefly about 15 years ago. We're about to celebrate 15 years. So if you haven't heard of us, please come by. We have a booth out there in the exhibit hall. We'd love to chat and talk to you about what you're doing in digital and how we can help you do it more effectively. So I'm going to go through, actually, you guys lined up in the right order. Good job.
We
Woo!
Yeah.
Winning!
Win for the day.
That was just sort of random when you started. So
We planned the whole thing.
you guys are so good. I really appreciate that. So Steve, quick intro, Ty, then Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everybody. My name is Steve Spawn. I am the Senior Director of Development at Able Gamers. Able Gamers is a 501c3 nonprofit that creates opportunities to enable play and help defeat social isolation for people with disabilities, particularly in the video game space. Now, the lawyers make me say that. Actually, what we do is we help people with disabilities be able to connect to video games by helping them figure out what the controllers they need to play, if it's assistive technology, and then we give it to them for free through a very extensive peer counseling process. And essentially, our job is to make sure that the 56 million people with disabilities can access digital entertainment through video games.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Ty.
I'm Ty Hardy. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a contractor and consultant. I work mostly in the web and digital space. So right now I'm doing a lot of web content management stuff. I've been doing digital accessibility work for about 4 years now. And outside of that, in my own private life, I do a lot of disability justice work, a lot of trans and queer work, and food justice work as well. So that's me.
I didn't know about the food. I want to hear more about that. Okay. Cool. Kelly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Russell, and I am actually a professional benefit auctioneer. But what I do is I work with a company. I'm the CEO of Artisan Auctions, and we help nonprofits raise record-breaking money for their great work. During the pandemic, it forced us to get creative about how are we going to do this fundraising. So we had to branch into that virtual world and bridge the gap to make sure that everybody had access to be able to participate in these virtual events. So that is what I do. I'm coming from a little different perspective.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everyone. We will be hearing more from the panelists in a moment, but thanks for the quick intros. So like I said, we're going to just kind of go a little high level. First off, I'd love to just get a show of hands. Is anyone here already really familiar with digital accessibility? Are you already doing things at your organization? Some? A little bit? Okay. Well, that's good. I'm glad that you're here to learn more. And those of you who are not yet sort of incorporating digital accessibility practices in your web, your social, email, all those things, happy that you're here. Love to help you learn a little bit more and see how we can help you make this priority with your folks up there controlling the budgets, because this is a priority that we're very passionate about. So a lot of times people want to kind of maybe push back sometimes on us and say digital accessibility, that's great, it's not really my audience, I maybe don't need to worry about it, but I'm here to help bust some of those myths and say 1 in 4 American adults has at least one disability, and when we talk about disabilities, obviously there's a whole range that we'll get into. So it's not just physical, it's not just sort of, oh, I work with guide dogs for the blind or hearing impairment. There's a whole range of cognitive and mobility and different types of disabilities that we'll talk about. So it's really important to expand, first of all, people's definitions of what disabilities are, what they mean, and how those impact folks' abilities to interact with your digital in particular, because that's our space. So it definitely impacts different populations differently, and more disabilities appear in different areas of the population. As you can see here, different by race or age. It's just one of those things to be thinking about. Again, like folks, I think, have an idea about how many folks have a disability or what does it look like to have a disability. And it's really, there's tons of hidden disabilities as well that you wouldn't necessarily see when you look at people on the street or out and about or on TV or wherever you see them on social. There's a lot there that's beneath the surface, so it's certainly important to kind of expand your understanding and definition. So that's first off. And then sort of what does it mean when you have those disabilities? What does that mean for you in your life, and how are you coming into the world? Like these are some unknowns that people don't think about, but certainly like if you're living with a disability, you have a much harder time generally just getting around. Many times you have a lot harder time interacting with people, just sort of doing some things in your day-to-day life that those of us without a disability, generally speaking, just take for granted. So a lot of it is sort of like the added mental stress, the added time it takes to do things, the added things you have to think about, that those of us without a disability, and I also like to say that every one of us is sort of temporarily able-bodied. If you're able-bodied today, awesome, that's great. That's your present state of being. But all of us will experience some form of disability in our lifetimes, whether it's a temporary disability because you had an accident and suddenly you now are walking with crutches and a cane, or it's more permanent. Lots of folks are obviously getting diagnosed with different sorts of diseases that become more debilitating over time. And each one of us, if we're lucky, will age. And certainly as you age, your abilities decline across the board, so both physical and mental and cognitive abilities generally decline as you age. So even though you might be young and relatively able-bodied today, that certainly changes over time or again with different circumstances. And so different people's life experiences also impact the likelihood that you'll have a disability. So definitely there's a correlation between folks living with a disability and their ability to get higher ed and get a college degree and things like that and experience those types of things. It definitely goes down. And then obviously folks with a disability are more likely to be living in poverty. So it's just like, again, it's these intersections of different ways that the cards get kind of stacked against you in terms of being able to just interact and participate in life fully. So one of the things, since we're a digital agency, the best place, the place we focus our energy is how can we help folks with different abilities interact with things in the digital space most effectively and equally. Those are just some grounding ideas. And so obviously this is not just about making sure that the code is right or the language is right or this and that. It's really obviously about the people behind the scenes and saying this is about making sure that folks can show up and interact with you and your organization most effectively. You don't want to ever put up a barrier or close a door in someone's face when they're trying to come to your digital spaces and interact with you or engage with you. And you think, I think a lot of times people just don't understand there's some inadvertent things happening, sort of some like, oh, I didn't know. And so that's really what the point of these sessions are, is to help people understand and learn and sort of go, oh, gosh, I have to have my eyes open. We've been doing accessibility for a while, but honestly, we've been going deeper into this space in the last 2 years in particular, and everybody on our team has had many sort of eye-opening moments and sort of just these aha moments, and sort of the learning keeps going for us as well. So if you're just starting to tune into this as an area, don't feel bad. It's totally, normal to be like, oh, I didn't think about that, or I didn't understand that, or I didn't have that learning, and I didn't understand maybe the depth of how disabilities actually impact our population as a whole. But it is about the people. We really are about inclusivity first and foremost, and accessibility in the digital spaces is the way we can do that most effectively. So basically breaking it down in very simple terms, accessibility is just making sure that folks can have the opportunity to acquire information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as anyone else. So it's very broad, it's very open, and it is something you have to think about how each user is going to show up with their own set of circumstances, their own abilities, and say, can I make sure that I'm doing the best job I can putting my digital pieces out in the world? Can anyone show up and access them, interact with them, and have a pleasant experience with it, so they maybe want to come back again and again and interact with my organization or my cause. So it's really basic. Again, it's very much a user-centered experience. So when you hear people talk about user-centered design or user experience or people-centered websites or these different things, accessibility really is at the heart of that. Because if you're not making it accessible, it certainly isn't user-centered. It's not user-specific if you don't put accessibility at the core of that. And obviously, this is again one of those things where you're thinking about like, what does that mean? So you do have to do quite a bit of work, both with yourselves and your team, but certainly the best thing to do is to help get different folks with different abilities coming to your digital properties and interacting with them. Because you think about just imagine yourself in a situation, again, if you happen to be a fairly able-bodied person at this time in your life. Think about things that you might be unable to do if you were to show up in different digital properties and you can't pay bills, or think about how every single thing you do right now is digitized. Like every single thing that you do is basically on an app, on your phone, on the computer. Very few things happen now even with a phone. Like you're literally doing everything through a digital account, an app, whatever, and think about how difficult it would be sometimes to interact with that information or try to just do basic things in your life without being able to have an accessible experience in that app or that website. You wouldn't be able to do most things in your life. So this is really critical. Finally, it's starting to come across most people's sort of attention and understanding, but we have a long, long, long way to go about getting this information out to folks and making sure that people are making the transformation so that folks can do, again, in your cases, come, learn about your organizations, learn about your cause, and certainly get information, attend, or help interact, get involved, donate, sign up, get your emails, that sort of stuff in the most appropriate way for them. So folks that are living with disabilities and trying to navigate the digital world, like Steve said when he started his conversation there, is that most folks will use some sort of assistive technologies. So what this means is a kind of a wide variety of tools that have been built to help folks with different abilities, again, interact with and sort of navigate and use digital properties. So when we talk about the disabilities in the digital space, we are generally talking about the vision, hearing, mobility, hand use, cognition. Again, cognition are the ones that I think are the most hidden for folks, and you don't think about well, what does it mean if you have a cognitive disability, and how does that impact? You can still use a mouse, you can still hear if the video is playing. What does that mean? So certainly these are some examples of some of the assistive technologies that need to be thought of when you're building your digital properties, and we can go into this. I'm not going to go, this is not a super technical session, so we're not going to go into how each of these work or how they're used, and there are tons of resources out there, and I have a resource slide at the end that you'll get a copy of the slides, or you can take some notes and take some of these down. But this is just at a glance a few of the most common assistive technologies that folks will use, and some things that you might need to start thinking about incorporating into your testing when you use, to use when you're building out digital properties. And so, again, those assistive technologies certainly exist, but again, the best way to help make sure that your digital properties are functioning well is to actually have folks come and test your site, and so, or your digital properties across the like video, social, emails, all these things. Have different folks come and test, or you can work with some of our partners out there to help you have folks with different disabilities test your properties and make sure that they're working well. And certainly it's better to start anything new that you're doing with accessibility in mind rather than going out and trying to retrofit or fix things after the fact. And I'm just going to put a plug in here for if folks have been hearing other folks talk about, when people talk about digital accessibility right now, there's a lot of folks talking about these overlays like Accessibility and some of those types of products. And I just want to say, please don't. They're like, they kind of help in some ways, and then they kind of hurt in many others. And honestly, it's sort of like the equivalent to me, or a similar type of experience, is just using Google Translate to actually make it show up in the right language. It's much better to get a native speaker to come in and actually do the work, translate your site, make it real, make it authentic. Similarly, Accessibility and those other technology overlays, if you put them on your site, they just sort of do this sort of blanket code, and they try to help fix things. But again, sometimes they really end up doing quite a bit more harm, and there's already been a lot of folks with disabilities coming out, and if you haven't seen those articles, they're like, please don't. So again, lots of benefits that we can get into, and we'll talk about as our panel kind of talks about their experiences, but certainly it's empowering. You want to improve access. You want to have opportunities to connect with more folks. It's making it's really about the user. But the benefits for you, obviously, like you obviously are going to show up better in search engine results. You're going to have, people are obviously going to think, oh, good, these people are paying attention to this. This is an important issue. I'm glad to see that X organization is taking this seriously and showing up. I don't know if you know about sort of the generational breakdowns that are happening right now, but young folks in particular are looking at websites and organizations' presence out in digital and saying if they're not showing up with the right accessibility and the right sort of inclusive language and imagery and these types of things, even if they themselves don't experience that disability or that sort of marginalization, they will not participate with that organization. They won't shop there. There's a much more discerning kind of point of view happening with younger generations. So if you are trying to, like every organization I know, is trying to appeal to and interact with and get more young people coming to your organization, if you don't have accessibility happening on your website, there's a surefire way to turn off a younger generation. Again, even if they can interact with your digital properties themselves, they will often choose to not participate with the organization. And obviously it increases your customer base, and as we'll talk about some of these things, it increases your ability to raise money. I think folks with disabilities have something about like $1 billion of disposable income at their, in their space. So if you're not making your forms accessible, sometimes executive directors at least will hear, hey, we're not raising enough money. We're closing the door to potential fundraising that could happen. That certainly also gets people's attention and helps spur this into action at your organization. And obviously right now, if anyone else is maintaining attention, lots of people are getting sued. And just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean you're not eligible. Like you could be subject to a lawsuit if somebody was trying to interact with your digital properties and they can't. purchase or interact with your organization in some way, you also are subject to these. It's the law right now to have an accessible website and apply and actually comply with the standards. It's just there isn't a great body of folks out there enforcing it, and so it comes down to sometimes it gets to a lawsuit that actually makes an organization or a company comply. So don't do that. Don't be that org. Do it because it's the right thing to do. So there's lots of stuff in here about writing. Again, there's like a ton of resources in here about different ways to think about accessibility. So it's not just, again, code. We look at it at Firefly as sort of the intersection of three major items. Yeah, there's sort of the language, there's the imagery, and there's the code. It's sort of like your three legs of your stool. So lots of folks and different companies really focus on the code and the code base, because there are web content accessibility guidelines, WCAG, that very much like lay it down for you down to the very nitty-gritty detail about how to make your code accessible. And that also goes into things like color contrast. So it kind of bleeds from development into the design realm to make sure that it's accessible for folks. But there's all sorts of other things in sort of the writing that we like to bring into sort of your content. So it's sort of the layering out of inclusive content with accessible design and the code base that's accessible to make that really inclusive, welcoming experience for folks in your digital properties that makes it work. So you can have a really accessible code base, but have not lovely or open language, and that doesn't really provide that sort of welcoming, joyful experience either. So you have to think about how all of these things play together. And so it's not just one piece of it. You have to really think about it as again, that three-legged stool. Without one of those legs, it does kind of fall over. And then lastly, before we get into more from the panelists, it's a lot to think about, and I'm really glad to see that folks are here and taking this seriously. But honestly, and I have some other sort of kind of hints and tricks, like how to get going, how to get started with this. If you are at an organization where you don't have this going yet and you're thinking about it, there's some ways to do some quick audits of your digital properties to say, like, it honestly gives you like a score. And I'll say that on a couple of these. It'll go through your website in particular, and it'll give you a score of accessibility. And that's really looking at your code base and your color contrast and things like that. Something that it can look at really quickly with a scan of your site. So there are scans you can do, it'll give you some sense, and it'll lay it out for you, spell out where the problems are on your existing site. I've seen some pretty sad scores right now, so there's definitely some work to do. But there are sometimes some fixes that you can do. You kind of look at the ones that are the most pressing in your digital and maybe just make some small adjustments. I would say the best thing and the best advice is sort of thinking about it as make some small adjustments while you can. But honestly, it's really it's going to take a bit of an overhaul, starting with like your brand and your brand colors and sort of your language and these things. And you kind of have to think about it as a pretty good comprehensive project undertake. But you can do small fixes along the way. Even just putting in alt tags and things like that can really, really help with some of these needs for assistive technologies. But this is the time to go to your board or go to your executive director and start to really make the case for a bigger project and say, maybe it can't happen next week or next month, but start to look at that quick list and then think, okay, bigger timeline is we need to really think about this more comprehensively. And honestly, testing as you go is critical. So with that, are there any quick questions right now about anything I just covered before we get into more with our guest panelists? Any quick questions anybody got? Yeah. So avoiding CAPTCHA, so you said, yeah. Yeah, it's a hard one. Again, it's one of those, there's a lot of these places where folks have to either fill out forms or fill out information in the midst of like trying to navigate through sites. And mostly it's one of those like, try to reduce the barriers of accessing or filling out and completing forms. I don't know that I have another one off the top of my head. I don't know, Ty, you're in the web space. I don't know if you
Google
have.
also has a really great CAPTCHA software that you can integrate automatically, especially through AdWords. So there's a special disability application you can apply for. So if you go through one of the accessibility companies like Google, put CAPTCHA on your website, there's a little check mark you can click that basically says, I am disabled. You put in an application that's usually automatically approved with submitting your license or proof of disability, and then it'll give you an audio file that you can listen to instead of having to look at the screen. Also, some JAWS applications are able to read those better than the standard CAPTCHA.
Great. That's why he's here. Just kidding. Yeah, so obviously there's some options in there. As you're going, again, you'll go through and you'll get these generally get this big sort of laundry list of things that are sort of not meeting the compliance. And again, it's good to kind of start with your website, and then you can think about your larger digital landscape. Because it takes some time to become familiar with all the different things that are going to be problematic. And once you identify it on your website, it's then easier to try and implement across other pieces of your digital landscape. Cool. So let's spend some time, now that we've had an overview and we have some ideas about digital accessibility, what it is, why we're doing it, why it's important, and how prevalent sort of disabilities are in the population, and maybe you didn't know about that. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to go a little bit deeper of like a quick intro of saying kind of how we got into this work, different things that have, kind of brought you to the space that you're in today. And then we have some other sort of follow-on questions to get into. So Steve, if you can start, then Ty, then Kelly, that'd be great.
This is what I always tell advocates, is that almost none of us chose to be an advocate. Almost all of us fell into advocacy because there was something passionate that you wanted to do, and there was a barrier in the way. And then you started tearing that barrier down, and then you realized that, oh crap, this is a barrier for other people too. So you start trying to tear that barrier down for everybody. And then before you know it, you realize that you're not really working on what you wish you were. You didn't get to be a writer, you didn't get to be a video game developer. You got to be someone who is tearing those barriers down for other people. Because if you don't do it, who's going to? So you need to do it yourself. So no one in this room or watching this video probably said to themselves when they were 8 years old, I can't wait to grow up and be an advocate. Woo, it's gonna be exciting. And no, nobody said that. So we all just grow up and do this thing because we want to make the world a better place. And a lot of what Jen was saying about people not realizing it because you're too deep in the weeds is a lot of it too. So you might be a super progressive, you might be not a progressive. Disability is not something that cares about your political affiliation. It doesn't matter. Disability is disability all the way around, right? But you still want to do the right thing to help other people. That's what really matters. And sometimes you're so deep in it, you don't see it. A really quick anecdote that I love is a panel like this happened for me about 10 years ago back in Boston. We were talking at a video game convention, and we were meeting with developers and young, inspired game devs who want to do things better in digital accessibility, and they want to be better people. And after the panel, as often happens in these, some people come up and ask you individual questions. And this one group comes up and says, hey, I'm a bunch of developers from Blizzard Activision. Have you ever played any of our games? And I go, yeah, I love playing StarCraft. It's actually one of my favorite games. And they go, oh, cool, I'm actually one of the lead developers on StarCraft. I'm like, oh, that's cool, really cool. We start talking about accessibility, and they're like, what do you think we could do better? And I'm like, well, your mini-map in your game is green and red. And that's really hard for some people, because green and red colorblind is the most common. And it's really hard to tell information if you're going based on just two colors of green and red. And he stops, cocks his head to the side, and he goes, huh, I'm colorblind. I probably should have known that. And I went, oh, okay. So it didn't happen because he himself dealt with that all of his life. So he had always found ways of conquering that particular disability, and he didn't think about it anymore. And I think that's the thing that some of us get into, whether it's your website or your product, is you are used to dealing with your challenges and barriers, and you're used to figuring out how to get around those. And so people like us up here are the ones that get to stand in your way and tell you when you're so deep in it that you don't see the trees to the forest anymore.
Excellent story. Thanks. Ty.
I think for me, how I ended up getting into it is a little bit of the same story. So I think on the topic of what Jim was talking about, how people's, what I'd like to say is people's access needs change over time. I was born with cerebral palsy, so I was born with no motor function in my legs, and I have a little bit different access needs, and so as a child, I kind of grew up navigating a space that wasn't really designed for me, and needing these assistive tools and being in spaces that most often didn't want me there, and so. As a young child, I knew that I had to start telling people, speaking truth to power, and really educating other kids in my community. And that was kind of my first kind of taste. As I grew up and got into the professional space, I kind of knew that I wanted to go into UX, user experience, and then I found digital accessibility, and that became like a major love of mine, obviously pointing back to some things in my youth. And that's kind of, those are the main ways that I've gotten into it. I think in the digital accessibility space is really cool because there's a lot of resources that cost money, but there's a lot of resources that don't cost money to learn about it. And so that's good as long as you have time and institutional and professional support from the organizations that you're working with. It can be really easy to pick up some quick skills. So that's kind of my little story.
Awesome.
I'm a little newer to this space. For me, when COVID came along, it forced us to think more creatively about how to make access available for everyone in this new world we lived in terms of fundraising. And so for me, what we did was we tried to pioneer a new path to make sure that all these incredible nonprofits could continue to raise money. And a lot of the nonprofits that we work with have folks that are attending these virtual events that had additional considerations that needed to be made. And so we kind of were trying to take what we did in a ballroom and bring it into a screen, which is very different, and everyone got to experience that to a point. So everyone kind of got to experience how a streaming situation can be quite different from being live in a ballroom. So our whole digital accessibility came when COVID came, and we learned how to bring that ballroom experience into a screen so people could sit at home, still engage, still fundraise, and still be a part of helping with all of the incredible organizations that they wanted to support. So I'm a little newer to this space, and it was forced upon us with COVID, but I think that one of the things we found is that there are ways to bring people together and to consider anyone that has, again, all the different cognitive disabilities, anything that can help them better understand your organization through that screen experience rather than being in real life. A little different.
Right. I mean, I think there's a little bit of the reality there of saying everything is becoming increasingly digitized, obviously, as it has been anyway, but definitely we all saw a big shift in COVID that we're obviously still sort of looking at and understanding the long-term impacts of in our organizations as we navigate our lives, those types of things. But what I'm seeing definitely is more of a hybrid approach, essentially, kind of going forward. And I'm not sure that we're ever going to go back, to anything than a hybrid approach, which I think is an interesting opportunity to expand the folks who can interact. But at that point, it's making sure that you're expanding that access appropriately. That's sort of where we came into this kind of realization too about just the increase of digital and our lives, sort of saying this isn't going anywhere, and helping organizations really kind of embrace the idea that if this was maybe on the back burner before, it has come screaming to the front burner at this point of saying, I have to do this, I have to understand how to make those folks who maybe started interacting with my organization during COVID in a new way because they weren't able to before, and now it's more available to them. Gosh, I need to make sure that I'm doing it correctly. Yeah, so thanks for all of those. Yeah, so we have kind of a variety of experiences, personal, professional spaces. I'm happy to sort of like turn this into more of a Q&A, and I can ask some questions, but I'd also love if folks in the audience have questions, please jump in. We can go through another round, or if anybody has a burning question to start off, I'm happy to go straight to audience folks, because this is your time. And I don't know how, I guess there's no way we can't get questions from folks that are streaming, right? There's no way to do that? It's just more of a watching, not interacting. Got it. Cool. No
We got a
problem.
couple here.
Yeah, right here.
I've heard during the presentation person first language, and I'm curious what kind of contextual factors and like processes go into decision making about whether to use identity first language or person first.
Let me repeat that. So person first, that decision making that happens to go into whether person first or identity first language. Yeah, and Steve, you had a response?
I laughed. It is the trickiest question in accessibility. I'm going to tell you something you don't want to hear. There's no right answer. So here's the truth of the matter. People should be able to label themselves, and you have to give them all the opportunities you can to let them do that. So I know you'd love for me to say you should definitely use X person first, or you should definitely use identity first. The problem is that everybody has a different viewpoint. So for example, me, I prefer person first. I'm a disabled person. That's who I am. I am not a person with disabilities. My organization, Able Gamers, uses identity first. So they are a person with a disability. I'm a disabled person. So when you have the difference in that and what you prefer, it depends on which way you're facing. I'm a disabled person, so nobody can come up to me and say, man, Steve, you really are a person with disabilities. It's a thing you have. And I can be like, well, no, it's not a piece of luggage. I'm not dragging it along. I'm disabled. That's what I am. Nobody can argue with me because that's my particular viewpoint. But if you're an organization, it's often better to go with a person with disabilities because there are more people who tend to identify that, so you'll tend to take less flack for it. However, you're still going to have people who are mad at you for doing that way as well. And what you basically have to use is figure out the most neutral way of doing it. When I'm writing text, I try to use both. I mix it up. I'll say, like, I'm a disabled person, but for people with disabilities, X, Y, Z, so that you're using both, so that you're paying homage to people who identify both ways.
Great.
And that's how I would respond as well. Like, I usually use both for myself and for others, depending on what I'm doing. And it could change on the day or just how I'm feeling. So, you know, it's like, just depends.
Yeah. Let people label themselves. That's my best advice.
Gives them
Yes.
power too.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just tricky. I think that's a good conversation to have at your organization. Obviously, when you're writing content for your site or for your like social or the things, it's just sort of maybe figure out a way to do some blending, you know, and that sort of thing too. And sort of say how, certainly if you're writing from an organizational standpoint, I think make a call a little bit one way or the other. And then if you're having other folks maybe write a blog, or if other folks are doing more of their stance, obviously honor how those folks want to use that language in their work. But it is something to bring up as a dialogue, I think, at your organization for sure. Thank you for that
And
question.
I'd say as one final adjunct to that, pay attention to the niche community that you're trying to talk about as well. For example, if you talk about general disabled person with disabilities, it's 50-50. You're going to get some people who are upset either way. But if you start going into the deaf community or the autistic community, if you say a person with autism, you're going to offend a lot of people. Most autistic people that I have been friends with and have heard from in the community, they prefer to say, I am autistic. They prefer to claim that as a place of power. And so they don't necessarily want to hear that. Again, you should give them the option to label, but the same thing with being in the deaf community. You know, people in the deaf community don't like saying hard of hearing. That used to be big in the 80s and 90s. It's not anymore. Don't say that kind of stuff. Like, so pay attention to the niche community. Like, every community within the disability community has their own people. Pay attention to what they want. That's how you find the right answer.
Excellent point.
Learn.
Always ask. Sure.
When
So when you attend a workshop or a training, what are some techniques that really resonate? Anybody up here want to jump in on that first? Are you talking digital, or you're talking about physically in person?
Either one, whatever.
Okay. Okay. Anyone want to jump in on that?
I talk a lot, so you go ahead. No? Okay. Okay.
Go ahead, we'll let you go, Steve.
Okay. So you're talking about the efficacy of attending a workshop? You mean from like an accessibility standpoint?
Okay.
So when you're talking about accessibility and when you're attending a workshop, you just try to cater to as much of the audience as you possibly can. So having handouts, having the audio files ready and available, having the video files, make sure you have closed captioning. The fact that there's not an ASL interpreter up here right now is embarrassing, quite honestly. Something that I'll definitely lecture the Netroots people about later. These kind of things are easy and you can add them on very cheaply and very cost effectively. So I think you just have to remember that everybody has different access needs, as Ty said earlier, and you're trying to cover the biggest swath that you can. So whenever I'm organizing a tournament or a workshop or whatever, what I'm thinking of is, okay, what are the general scenarios that might come up? And then a lot of times I like to have a disability concierge where someone can go to you and say, hey, I got a wheelchair, that ramp is too steep, can you help me get up it? Or hey, I need an ASL translator. Or hey, I would like to talk to this person, but I can't because I am deaf or because I'm autistic and I need a translator. And in those moments, you want someone to be able to have them on staff to just be able to handle those specialized needs.
I love the idea of a concierge helping as well. I think that's a great idea that doesn't always translate out for folks. So speaking of being in a room versus virtually, that is what we did with the auction world, is we did anything we could to really try and help make sure if we had an event that we needed ASL or we needed any kind of translation, we would try and have that translation available through closed captioning in the virtual world, in the digital world there. We'd also make sure that we had an interpreter as often as possible and as many events as we possibly could, because again, it's just about making sure people can understand what you have to say. It's the same as if someone were to attend your business and they come to your business and they can't get to the door because there's not access. This is just happening first at your website level and your digital level to make sure that everyone can come through that digital door to learn more about your organization and to learn more about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's also wild because people think about accessibility as boring. And to me, what cracks me up is, did you know that Eminem has his own personal ASL translator? I know her. She's great. She has pink hair. She has a mohawk. She rocks out. When Eminem's up on stage doing her rapping, she is running around the stage, throwing her hands around. She's got her whole body into it. She's translating. She is bringing across the energy. It is not just someone up there in a turtleneck sweater just trying to do Eminem lyrics like a grandma. It's not a thing. So it doesn't have to be boring. It can be exciting too.
Yeah.
I
go ahead,
just wanted
Ty.
to add another thing on top of that, but I feel like getting good at communicating that you want to make sure everyone's access needs are met is important as well, and how you market the event as well. That's super important. So sitting down and thinking about how you're, talking about it and how you're kind of distributing that information of the things that you might be able to offer, or even being able to sit down with people before and have a conversation before about what they might need is very important and goes a long way.
That's really a great point. We oftentimes will ask our audience, what do you need? And when they buy a ticket for a virtual event or for a live event, do you have any specific needs that we need to address? You can ask them. They will tell you. They will be happy to tell you what they need.
Absolutely.
And then you can accommodate that.
Yeah.
Sure?
The follow on?
Ooh,
Yeah,
lots of hands.
I know.
So I know a lot of this has been kind of focused on web accessibility,
Yeah.
which is one of the biggest things, and I am in the process of redesigning a website, so I will have to be asking a lot of questions later about
Yeah.
that. But I'm really curious to know kind of, what do you think are some common pitfalls around other digital platforms like social media and email that you find are often overlooked?
is a wide open Pandora's box of goodness right there.
Well, I think it goes back to what Ty was saying about thinking about your marketing, thinking about, and what Steve was saying about even color blindness. How are you putting out the content? Are you considering what image you're going to use to give to your audience so that they can go, oh, they took me into consideration on this? I think it's those kinds of pieces that, for social media especially, that you have control over. You just have to own that control over it and say, oh, I want to do this, and I want to be really thoughtful in my approach so that I can make sure that I am accessible. I am absolutely accessible to anyone that needs me.
It's also about taking the time to do it. Like,
Yeah.
accessibility sometimes is a pain in the butt. Like, I mean, I love doing accessibility.
Right.
I hate doing alt text on pictures. It is annoying. I just want to put out my cool picture of the meal that I just had. I don't want to sit there and type it all in. But for somebody who also can't see the picture or can't see it well, I take the time to do it because there might be that audience portion of my Twitter who needs that. There's also options. For example, you go to your phones right now, go to Twitter. If you go to the accessibility settings buried beneath the options, because God forbid we put accessibility at the top, if you go deep in the menus, it has a little switch that you can flip that whenever you do a picture, and it doesn't have alt text, a warning will pop up and say, hey, you're about to tweet a picture without alt text. Do you really want to be a jerkbag? And you can go, yes, I do. And you can go ahead and post it. Or you can take the time to put your alt text in the photo. And so there's things like that on Facebook, on Instagram. They're all there. They're often buried deep in the UX, which is why we have great people like Ty to bring them up to the top and fight the power against those who are like, just put it at the bottom. No one cares about it. So look for those options, and that's a great way to move forward. Also consider a free program like Color Oracle. Color Oracle is a free program you can go look up on Google right now. I'm not getting kickback for it, unfortunately. And you can run any picture, any social media thing through a bunch of different filters to see if you have a different type of color blindness, because there are 3 primaries, but there are a bunch of secondary that you might see a different color. Some images people like to put out, especially in night vision, of dark greens and blacks, are almost completely invisible to someone who is monochromatic. So definitely go check those out. They're free resources, and they can make your content better.
I will put that on my list. I didn't have it on my list, as you can see. Go ahead, Ty.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And I would say another thing that is often overlooked, a lot of websites and organizations distribute information as PDFs, but they often don't make sure that those PDFs are accessible. And so that taking a day and looking up, PDF accessibility, finding some courses on it, doing a couple courses over a couple weeks can change like a lot for a lot of people. And I think that's one of the most important things that I would recommend folks do, because I think a lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations, distribute some of their most important forms and information as PDFs, and those PDFs are often not accessible at all. So,
Yeah, and to your point, email is just kind of a nightmare, but it is what it is, and we do a lot of it still. So obviously you have to take into consideration browsers, devices, email clients, like all these different things. So all I can say is test, test, test. Obviously there's a lot of like Email and Acid and other programs that will help you look at what it looks like and how it appears, and then you can throw in the accessibility testing through those, so it helps you look and see what again, how it will appear. I guess some of the biggest things with email is please, please, please don't just use a giant image with all of your text on an image in your email. That's like number one no-no. And obviously then where you do have images, just actually turn your images off on your email and send your email and see what it looks like. Because that's, again, when you're like, oh, if I'm looking at this, or again, use a screen reader to try and look at what your emails look and sound like at that point, So it's some of those types of things you have to really take into consideration, and some of those other areas. And as much as we have certain controls in the social media space, obviously there's a fair amount there that's out of your control. Like you can't tell any of those social media platforms to change the way they do anything. So you really have to look and dig, to Steve's point about what are they doing for accessibility? How can I make sure that I'm being as accessible as I can in the things that I have control over in the social media spaces, and doing that to your ability, and I love those cheaters too, to just say, make sure that it reminds anybody who's then posting on your organization's social that they should remember to do those key things when they're making posts and things like that. So those are great hints. Other questions? I know we got about 10 minutes right back here. Yeah.
This is a question for anyone. I'm wondering if there are specific funding streams that nonprofits can apply for the purpose of paying a consultant to come help or paying to fix things that you need to fix to
Yeah.
the work become more accessible. Just thinking about, trying to fight for that in our organization, funding is the issue.
Right. Great question. Let me repeat that. So are there funding sources available to help organizations specifically with, making digital accessible? That's something we're looking into. I know there's some government grants, but I know, Ty, it sounded like were you going to answer?
I heard about something recently, and I'll come contact you after, and I'll see if I can find the resource
Yeah.
that I was thinking of.
And if anybody else in the room has already a known source, or it would be great to pull that in. And that's one of the things we're actively looking at, because it is an investment for the organization, and we want to make accessibility accessible. So we're also like, how can we help? Well, I do know, again, there are some government grants. I don't have them like off the top of my head, so that's something that I have as a to-do for sure, for us to be able to provide that as a resource out for organizations. But accessibility is becoming, again, more and more of a topic, and people are getting more and more concerned about it. So some of the big ones that I know of, and the Hewlett and like Packard Foundations and things like that, they give big grants to a lot of nonprofits for tech. Specifically, when I worked at Planned Parenthood, we got a lot of funding just for technology assistance, capacity building, and those types of things. So I can't imagine that they wouldn't also be interested in sort of thinking about grants for organizations in the tech space specifically to work on accessibility. That's a great question, and I'll definitely,
Can I add on to that?
you can.
One thing I would recommend too is talk to some other funders that you have. Some of your donors may be really active about digital accessibility, and they will just underwrite your cost for you. So that is an option that you have as well, is to just go talk to your donors directly and say, we want to make sure that our site is digitally accessible, and we want to make sure that anyone that comes to it has the opportunity to learn more about us. Would you help us by funding that? Oftentimes, if you're speaking to their heart, they will say, absolutely, no problem. I'll be there for you. Here's a check.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point. Ask grants that you're already getting, or things that funding sources that are already available to you. See if they will let you use it for that specific purpose is always a great idea. Or, and then like when you're up for that renewal, say I'm going to write in some accessibility into that grant renewal. And a lot of times, if the organization has already been funding you, they would be like, great idea.
I
So-
love angel donors.
Yeah, and individual donors for
Yeah,
sure.
angel donors will do that for you if it's something that they're
That
excited
they're
about as well.
passionate about. And honestly, once you even start talking to them about it, they may not have known about it,
Yep.
and they get excited about it pretty quickly. And they understand, like, ooh, light bulb moment for them. And then they go, yes, I want to help you make that work for your organization. Really great call out. Other question?
So I work in communications, and I'm having a conference that's going to be a hybrid conference. I have a lot of concerns about making our virtual experience not seem lesser. Do you guys have any advice on that?
Anybody?
I mean,
Yes.
don't make it lesser. I mean, that's essentially it. Making a hybrid event, I'm currently in the planning stages of making one. The answer, it sounds simplistic and kind of sarcastic. But if you're going to have in-person talent at the conference, then make sure it's broadcast on the virtual. If you're going to have an act, like an MC or a famous person or some sort of musical group, make sure that it's broadcast. Make sure that people can interact. There are platforms out there that allow you to interact as if you were in physical presence in the digital space. Have that running parallel to your physical event at the same time. There are ways that you can intertwine the two so that somebody has to go in the digital space in order to access a prize. You can lure them there with raffles and giveaways and hide and seeks. There are things that you can do to intertwine them two so that they can come together as one unit.
Awesome.
Yeah, Steve's right. You just have to, whatever you are going to do at your live event, do at your virtual one. And I would also add, you can do a little more to be more accessible. Make sure you have the translators or any of those pieces that people really need. Put those in place just like you would at a live event as well. It's the best advice.
And ignore the technical people, because they're gonna be like, it'll be a pain to do that. Be like, yes, it will. Do
Yes,
it
it will.
anyway.
Do it anyway.
And it's going to be fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard, but I think, yeah, if you kind of just sit down and really do some really good planning pretty far in advance and think it through and think about, yeah, how is this going to translate from one venue to the other? How can we run them simultaneously? And then, like Steve said, sort of weave them back and forth. I love the idea of like having folks at a live event force them to go into the virtual space and look for things, or yeah, like prizes, or just incentivizing the experience in both directions, I think will help make it a richer experience. Same thing, I've been to a few live events where there's other streams that are happening in the middle of a live event, so you're also again incorporating feedback and information, or a speaker from afar, things like that sort of again bring the two together as effectively as we can. And certainly I think things will just continue to move in that direction the more we kind of keep moving in our hybrid space. Just a couple of minutes. Any last questions for panelists? Yeah, last one.
I'm wondering if anyone has like an organization that they're a big fan of in terms of accessibility, or think they do a really good job.
I mean, Able Gamers is pretty cool.
No plugging, come on. Okay.
Oh yeah, Firefly, blah blah. Able Gamers, amazing.
No.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just there's a lot of accessibility out there that can be, particularly for the niche that you're looking for. So I don't know what medium you're looking for, but there are a lot of different ones out there. Able Gamers is good for video games, but we don't do film entertainment, so stuff like that.
But do swing by the booth at Firefly. They have lots of ideas.
Yeah.
So.
Who's paying you? Oh yeah, Firefly is.
Oh wait, check something out. Just kidding. No. Ty, do you have a favorite, or like what's a?
I guess for standards-based accessibility, W3C has a good website. Web Accessibility in Mind. If you're looking at what would someone do if they didn't buy the book every time, those are good sites to look at. Sometimes it might be a little bit more than what some sites might need for their audience base, because often they're going up to AAA standard and things like that might not be as necessary for certain content parts of a person's website, but it's good to see like some of the things that they do. One thing that I really like that W3C does is they put skip links at the top of their site, so that if you're scrolling and you only use keyboard, or you're someone that can only use the keyboard, or you're using a screen reader, you don't have to scroll all the way through the content to get to the section that you need. But those are some sites that I like to look at when I'm like, okay, what should I do here?
And I think my final advice would be accessibility consultants. Literally go hire people who have lived and work experience in this. Go to a place like Firefly. They owe me $10 now for saying that. And then, but employ actually disabled people. And you can do that pretty much on the cheap. It's only going to cost you a couple $100 to have someone who is actually disabled come through and look at your site. I don't want to downplay the role that companies who do this for a living have, but it's a different feeling when you have an actual consultant come through and read your language sensitivity, make sure it works, have a blind person use a JAWS reader, tell you where you're going wrong, and then you'll be able to better understand where your problems on your website are, and then you go to another place to fix it.
Yeah. Awesome. I know we're at time, but the slides will be available, and there's some resources here, and I'm going to add to it. And obviously, if folks have other things, I'd love to hear back from you all. If you're out there doing work and you just want to say, hey, This is just a limited one screen here, but if you have other questions and things like that, yeah, we're at the booth is 802 out there. Just come find us. Love to have a conversation. Thank you so much, Steve, Ty, and Kelly, for being here with us today. Really appreciate it so much. And thank you all for coming and for your great questions. And I hope you have a great rest of your conference.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks.
Thanks to everyone.